Spoiler alert, these spellings refer to August Heinrich Gera, G-E-H-R-A, the town of Gera, Germany, G-E-R-A, and Gera's son Gottlieb, G-U-E-R-A, who became known as a harpist and moved to France and started a music publishing business. I became familiar with August Heinrich Gera when I edited his viola concerto in C. This work was performed at the Moravian Music Festival in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 2013. It was not the first modern performance, however. That also took place in Bethlehem in 1957 with William Preusel as the featured soloist at an earlier Moravian Music Festival. And I'll play a bit of that from the 2013. Let the violist get her say there. There were several mentions of this concerto in the literature soon after this debut because there were so few viola concertos from that era. After this festival, the violist Paul Doctor included this work on his concert tours in Europe. The text from the program notes of that festival, unfortunately, but understandably, contains some factual errors. First of all, the year of his birth was wrong. And secondly, he did not work for a Russian count, but for a Reussian count. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. This information may have come from one of two standard sources of biographical information about 18th and early 19th century composers. Gerber's Lexikon der Tonkünstler, which expanded on the biographical content of Johann Gottfried Walther's lexicon. More about Walther in a moment and how he figures into Gera's story in a couple of potential ways, and Eitner's Quellen-Lexikon. Eitner's entry for Gera corrects Gerber's because Gerber gave Gera's first name as Johann rather than August. However, they both gave the incorrect year of birth as 1715. And I don't know what their sources were, so I can't explain their mistake. In the Neues Universal Lexikon der Tonkunst, in the middle of the 19th century, it perpetuated the errors of Gerber with the first name Johann and the incorrect year of birth, 1715. Records in our Gemeincat database provide composer names and the dates as supplied by OCLC's authority file in the 100 field, and as the manuscript displays in the 245 field. And this is from Herp's collection, and note several things. Number one, the authority record for Gera in blue has the incorrect year of birth. And two, spelling of Gera's last name in the 245 field is Gera, which is actually the name of the town in which Gera lived and worked for over 40 years. Now, while working on this cataloging project, we've been working with Backstage Library Works. They have a staff member who is a liaison with the Library of Congress staff who control authority records. We've supplied primary and secondary documentation to show Gera's year of birth was actually 1710. Why does that matter? Because the authority file used by RISM, the other database platform on which we're loading our catalog records, has been updated with the correct information. And there's the record for the same work that I showed you before from Gemeincat. Now, one of our go-to sources for Moravian persons is the Dienerblätter. It provides a brief outline of dates, places, and assignments of servants of the church. It also generally provides a citation of the source of information. I created a spreadsheet using these dates that were found in the Dienerblätter and two versions of Gera's memoir, which were obtained from Herrenhout, thanks to Olaf Knippe, and translated by Reverend Daniel Cruz, and from our own copy of the Gemeinnachrichten from the vault downstairs, which was translated by Reverend Roy Ledbetter. I paired the comments from these memoirs with the dates from the Dienerblätter entry, added other dates, if provided, which could fill out a biography. I then added other primary and secondary sources that I collected. And some of this information was specifically about Gera. That's August Heinrich Gera. Other information pertained to events and locations where he lived at that time. Now, I was intrigued by the Dienerblätter's undated mention of Gera's learning oboe and organ in Erfurt. Unfortunately, neither version of his memoir mentioned his teachers. But, quote, "When my school years were over, I went with two boys to Erfurt for musical instruction to be an oboist." The other version was translated, "From my youth on, I was inclined toward music, and with several other youths went to our choir director, organist, who trained us in the violin. Finally, when my school years were over, I went to Erfurt to be to an apprenticeship with an oboist." Bruce Haynes' book, The Eloquent Oboe, provides a listing of oboe instructors by town. Unfortunately, Erfurt is not listed. It's worth noting, however, that many well-known organists were located in Erfurt during and before Gera's time there. Before his arrival, Johann Pachelbel was an organist in one of the largest churches there. During Gera's time there, Pachelbel's student, Buttstedt, occupied the same bench. One of Buttstedt's many students was Johann Gottfried Walter, a relative of J.S. Bach, who became organist in Weimar and would later become Gera's father-in-law. We see that Gera spent between 1 and 4 years in the Hessian regiment as an oboist. One memoir states that he was 14, the other that he was 17. But when he was 18 or 19, he landed a job in Weimar. Although it seems strange to us today, Militär Oboist, or military oboist, was a thing back then. You may recall years later that Moravian composer David Moritz Michael served in a similar role. Now, due to my interest in Weimar from my work with Ernst Wilhelm Wolf's Easter Cantate, which, by the way, is going to be performed by Moramas tomorrow night at Kernersville Moravian Church, and then again on the 19th at Home Moravian, I bought a copy of Aaron's book, Die Weimarer Hofkapelle, to provide background information and context. When I saw that Gera had spent a few years in Weimar, I checked the source to see if he were listed. I was disappointed not to find him. Undeterred, I emailed some contacts I'd made while visiting Weimar in 2016. They'd also been the folks that had suggested this book. And I managed to get a copy of Gera's military records from Weimar. His last name is spelled G-E-R-A-U. This record lists him on line 6 of 10 Hauptbeweisten in the Duke of Saxe-Weimar's military regiment. This document is dated 1729. Concerning his service in Weimar, Gera wrote in his memoir, "I came into the service of Duke Ernst August as oboist and his bodyguards. We had to make table music, Tafelmusik, and other music for him on almost a daily basis. This Weimar military document is dated 1736. It states Gera is 26 years old, which confirms his year of birth as 1710. Again, you'll notice his name is spelled G-E-R-A-U. The town of his childhood, though not his birth, Langewiesen, is given, and he is listed as belonging to the evangelic religion. It was during his service in Weimar that he apparently wrestled with his faith. He claimed he was very pious, but he did not want to show it outwardly as if to boast about it. However, people noticed his behavior and called him a Herrnhuter, although he didn't know what they were talking about. At least one source that I saw claimed that Gera studied organ with Johann Gottlieb Walter, the city organist at Weimar at the Church of Saints Peter and Paul. Walter is known not only as an organist and composer, but as a lexicographer and the compiler of the Musikalisches Lexikon. Walter was a cousin of Johann Sebastian Bach. He arrived in Weimar in 1707, just 1 year before Bach arrived as a member of the orchestra there. Walter would later become Gera's father-in-law. Like Bach, however, Gera had a tough time leaving Weimar. Gera wrote in his memoir, quote, "In 1739, I unexpectedly received a call to Gera, a city to which I had not foreseen as my place of residence. Yet that was the place where the Savior wished to reveal himself to me as my Redeemer. In Weimar, I requested my discharge, for which I had often been longing. The Duke kept me waiting at the jail and could not make up his mind. That continued for half a year." He wrote further, "In Weimar, I was so well known that everyone almost became a fellow sufferer with me, that is, they sympathized with me. And as far as earthly matters went, I enjoyed much love." From the town of Gera, it was Heinrich the 25th who brokered a deal with the Duke of Weimar for Gera's release. Later, during his time in Gera, 25th's son, 30, was the reigning count. They were part of the Reuss family, the Reussische Graf mentioned earlier. There had been 3 lines of the Reuss family. The middle one had already died out, leaving the ältere Linie, the older line, and the jüngere Linie, the younger line. Of the younger line, there were several branches, including that of the town of Gera and a branch of the Ebersdorf, in Ebersdorf. And it was the Ebersdorf branch from which came Zinzendorf's wife, Edmuta Dorothea von Reuss. Now, it was in the honor of Emperor Heinrich VI, who raised that family to nobility, that all male members of the princely Reuss family are named Heinrich, belonging in the first year of each century. Heinrich the 25th Reuss here would have been the 25th born in that century. Kind of reminds me of the George Foreman. All 5 of his sons are named George. Some musical context for the town of Gera. Johann Sebastian Bach visited the town of Gera twice, first in 1721 and then again for several days in 1725, probably in connection with a guest performance at the Osterstein Castle there, which was the residence of one of the Heinrichs, Count von Reuss Gera. He was accompanied by 2 others, probably his wife Anna Magdalena and the barely 15-year-old Wilhelm Friedemann. He was paid a handsome honorarium for approving the organs in the churches of St. John's and St. Salvator's. Just a few years before August Heinrich Gera arrived in Gera, the Frederici family established a musical instrument manufacturing company there. Frederici had been a student of Zilbermann. Johann Friedrich Fasch had held a position as secretary in the town of Gera from 1715 to 19, and probably also performed in the Hofkapelle there. There apparently was not a Moravian congregation in the town of Gera, but there was a fellowship society in the vicinity to which August Heinrich Gera belonged. In his memoir, Gera mentions Master Brumhardt. After some time, I was made acquainted with the brethren there through the blessed Master Brumhardt. For the brethren in Jena had already learned about me. I had much knowledge of the Bible, but hadn't the right knowledge about Jesus, my crucified. A wise brother had told the others there that they should be cautious in dealing with me, for I was a smart aleck. From another version of Gera's memoir, a much tamer version, I got to know the Moravian Brethren in this place through the late Master Brumhardt, because the Brethren had already gotten to know me previously in Jena. Didn't say in what context. Brumhardt and Professor Budeus were well-known pietist leaders at the University of Jena. The biographical sketch of Moravian pastor Francis Lemke also mentions the influence of Brumhardt. Now, I tried to take a look at all the different compositions of Gera and tried to date them and put them in a spreadsheet along with all the information that I got from the Dienerblätter and the memoirs. And compositions might be dated in one of several ways. Only 2 of Gera's compositions are printed, however, but they're not dated and they don't have plate numbers. Other external factors must be used to date them. Other compositions appear in odes for a specific dated event, and there are times when the copyist dates the copy in the inscription. The most exact dates are those compositions which are based on daily texts. The title page of Gera's Primo Saggio does not provide a date. However, it must be after 1739, the first year of his employment for Count Royce of Gera, possibly even after 1745, the year of Heinrich XXX's 18th birthday. This mentions both Heinrich XXX and his sister Sophia Henrietta Dorothea. Although J.F. Pater provides the date that he copied this work, the 5th of September 1774, he states that it was written for the Married Couples Choir Festival on September 7th, 1763. Although there are other copies of this work, they don't provide any date information. We can rely only on Pater's inscription. Although it does not appear that any of the titles in this ode referred to the daily text for that day, this is the earliest dated composition of Gera I've been able to determine. He was 53 years old at the time. We've already seen Gera's Viola Concerto in C was copied by Pater in August of 1767 when he was 21 years old during a time of an illness. Pater's copies of the J.C.F. Bach Sinfonias date from the same period. We can only say that the Viola Concerto was composed before 1767. This set of arias, written for a children's Christmas Eve service, was copied by Pater in 1787. This was 2 years after Gera's death. Notice how Pater spells Gera's name. At this time, Pater was serving here in Salem. Just 2 years later, he would complete his set of 6 quintets. For other compositions, we can closely date them because they're based on daily texts for the day. Die gepflanzt sind in dem Hause, based on Psalm 92, is the daily text for that date in 1774. And you can see the other dates from the daily texts and references to specific titles. We have records of Die gepflanzt sind dem Hause in the Bethlehem congregation collection, but our copy is missing. However, another copy found on RISM was once part of a congregation at Niski, which is now in a library in Warsaw, Poland, and it bears the inscription for the 4th of May, 1774, and indeed that is the text for that day. Gera is listed as being an organist and a chamber musician. Did he not begin composing, or at least choral church music, until later? Or not compose choral church music for the Moravian congregations until later? Remember, he was a member of an affiliated Moravian fellowship, but his title was organist of the city church in Gera, which was not Moravian. As we'll see later, he apparently composed a lot of instrumental music that we know exists today. These are examples of the memoirs on file from Heinrich and from the Gemeinnachrichten in 1786, the year after his death. I think it's worth noting that while he served in affiliated Moravian society somewhere in the surroundings of the town of Gera, the church felt it was worth notifying the entire church worldwide of his passing through the Gemeinnachrichten. We read that Gera's wife died on Good Friday, 1770. He wrote in his memoir, "We were married almost 29 years when she went home blessedly on Good Friday, 1770, and the Savior had given us 9 children, 5 of whom had preceded her. The rest of them were in Moravian Brethren's congregations, although in the meantime, my dear Lenel, which is a nickname for Magdalena, followed her in Herrnhut, and my son Gottlieb in Lyon. Their son Johann Gottlieb became a well-known performer on harp and clavier and settled in Lyon, France, where he gave lessons and started a music publishing business under the name Gera, G-U-E-R-A. Johann Gottlieb died in Lyon, France in 1778. It's worth noting that most of the choral, vocal, sacred compositions of August Heinrich Gera we have in Moravian collections around the world, which can be closely dated, are from the period of his life after the loss of his wife in 1770. Did he fill the void in his life by concentrating on sacred composition? Did he apply himself more with the local Moravian Fellowship Society after she died? We simply don't know. Either or both are possible. Earlier in his memoir concerning the early years of their marriage, he referred to her as not yet awakened. Was she, at least in the beginning of their marriage, not as fully engaged spiritually? For May 4th, 1780, which was Ascension Day that year, Gera composed an anthem setting of the benediction from Jude, now unto him who is able to keep you from falling, etc. It was the daily text of that date. That benediction is preceded in the Bible by the exhortation, save others by snatching them out of the fire. Later that summer, fire would prove to be a turning point for the town of Gera and for the life of August Heinrich Gera. On September 18, 1780, fire erupted about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the fire quickly expanded throughout the city. It was a major, major fire. Within the city walls, 252 houses were burned. And in the new town, 28 houses were destroyed, 68 barns, which contained some recently harvested crops. Almost all of the approximately 7,500 inhabitants of the town of Gera had become homeless and had lost most of their belongings. 10 people died in the fire, and some citizens moved away forever. Concerning this tragic event, Gera wrote, when in 1780, while I was in Kostritz, Gera, and my lodgings were burned. I lost almost all my earthly possessions. I had to go into exile, first in a little village near Gera, and then wander on to Kostritz. I can never offer enough thanks for the faithfulness and kindness I enjoyed, especially to my many brothers and sisters in Barbie, Herrnhut, and Ebersdorf. The dear Savior especially showed me great mercy, so that for the most part, I remained unruffled and cheerful. I requested permission to move to the Moravian congregation in Herrnhut, but this came to naught. Either it was due to me or the dear Savior had his own plans. It was after reporting the fire of the town of Gera that August Heinrich Gera stopped writing in his own memoir. He was 70 years old. Even though he stopped adding to his own memoir, he did not stop composing. Gesegnet bist du mein Volk is a soprano duet with strings based on the daily text for May 4th, 1781. It's based on Isaiah 19:25. And this is what he started composing just in the weeks before the fire. Is on one of our recordings, He Restores My Soul, which is a collection of soprano duets. A later entry in his memoir notes, in the beginning of the year 1783, he suffered a severe hemorrhage which continued a long time, but it stopped after a while. Nonetheless, one saw that after that, his powers had diminished. We have evidence of what is essentially his last will and testament. We have his estate inventory. He wrote, "Since with old age I have more reason to consider my departure, I divide my little legacy between my two daughters as sole heirs, namely Christiana Maria in Ebersdorf and Johanna Erdmuta in Herrnhut. And for said daughters, to name the local manufacturer, Johann Heinrich Meyer, as executor with legal authority, that he procure and pay for my burial and take my estate on their behalf." And he addresses to the Count, "I therefore wish to do so with the most obedient respect, so that after my death, everything that was promised to my daughters could be handed over to them by virtue of the power of attorney. I, with all reverence, persist your very obedient August Heinrich Gera, the town of Gera, the 20th of December, 1784. While he stated he lost nearly everything in the 1780 fire, clearly he had some items of value, at least sentimental value, including books, scores, and musical instruments. One of the book titles you see is Ide Fide Fratrum. And there you see the signature of the executor of the estate, Johann Heinrich Meyer. On other pages of the spreadsheet that I assembled, I set up to coordinate dates mentioned in the Dienerblätter with events in the memoir, but I also created a list of musical works from our catalog, Mein Cat, and RISM, and other printed catalogs. I also compared what works were in his estate records with those that were in a published account of his son's publications. This is the French music publisher Gera of Lyon, a dated list, and compared works from that book to what was in his estate inventory. And I find a lot of overlap. So it looks like the son sent copies of his published works to his father. There is also indication from some of the works that were published by the son that they may have been provided by works that his father sent to him. Gruner was a composer that came later in the town of Gera, and Gruner is among some of the composers published by the son Gera in Lyon, France. We know of an undated collection of horn concertos. One of these is by Gera, along with some of his contemporaries. Some composers are well known today, such as Graun and Quantz. Others are still more obscure, like Fürster, Knechtel, and Rohlig. One secondary source notes that Gera was a horn player. We don't know that for sure, but his training and experience as an hautboist did not limit his practical playing experience to the oboe. In Herrnhut collections, there are a number of pieces by Gera, otherwise undated, which were copied by Christian David Jeschke, who was the organist and choir director at Herrnhut for about 40 years. He died in 1827, showing that perhaps for at least another generation after Gera's death, his music was still being copied and performed in Moravian communities. Since pulling these primary source materials together and providing them to the Library of Congress, we've now updated the name authority record for the correct year of birth of August Heinrich Gera. So a clearer picture of Gera is before us, and we now have a broader view of his compositions that we have yet to discover. And a couple of Gera's publications, speaking of harping, will be featured in a concert in June during the American Harp Society's conference. And Nola, a couple of his?
Two of his pieces.
Two of his pieces.
For sopranos and two harps with strings. That's on Tuesday, June 18th at 7:30 at Home Church. It's part of the Music at Home series and also part of the American Harp Society summer concert. It is free and open to the public. Hope you're there.
So it's kind of a new thing that's being discovered, harp literature in Moravian music. Gera was not the only one. Geisler, that we have a lot of music by Geisler that also has harp to it. And through the process of working in Gemeinkat, we've seen some of these compositions with harp. We're even in Dover, Ohio. So it's kind of an interesting area to be explored. Thank you very much.